Our third speaker is Dr. Michael Gibson. Dr. Gibson is an interventional cardiologist, a cardiovascular researcher, and an educator. Dr. Gibson founded WikiDoc.org, the world's most widely viewed open source textbook of medicine. He is editor-in-chief of 7,000 contributors. Dr. Gibson served as a medical lead in a partnership with Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo to design a scheme of classifying medical content for the internet to improve medical search results. And so, Dr. Gibson, we thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Hi, I'm Mike Gibson. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. Today's meeting is all about physician autonomy and empowering physicians. One way we can empower physicians is by giving them access to medical information. You know, they always say knowledge is power. But if that knowledge is behind a paywall, then you're not empowered. What we've been doing for 10 years now is liberating that information out from behind paywalls at a site called WikiDoc. We have 100 full-time volunteers that have now made over 1 million edits to the content. And we feel this is a very important process to democratize access to medical information. So I'm going to take you on my journey from the copyright world over to the copyleft world, a world in which the information is legally prevented from being owned by any one person. Well, my journey begins in Stillwell, Oklahoma, back in 1967. I grew up there as an only child. My only friend was some books and some other people, my grandmother notably. My grandmother sent me down the street with a nickel to the book fair, and she said, buy yourself a book, knock yourself out. Well, all I could get was one volume of the Encyclopedia. It was the letter C. Maybe that's why I became a cardiologist today. But that was my ticket out of Oklahoma. That was when I went global, because I could see what was outside of Oklahoma. And I was completely up to date for everything in 1927, 40 years earlier. So it opened my eyes. It was very enlightening to see what else was going on around the world. But the big day came when at the Safeway store, my mother was able to begin buying different volumes of the encyclopedia, the Golden Book Encyclopedia. So if your mother bought enough groceries, you could get a free, volume of the encyclopedia. And what it really taught me was that access to information can be so important in expanding your worldview and your perspective. Well, if you fast forward to my time in medical school, I had a new book, a new encyclopedia that was Gray's Anatomy, and I learned in a peculiar way. I learned a lot by writing things down and by drawing things, and you should see a shoebox worth of note cards that I made up. My son recently discovered these, and he was dumbfounded, as to how much I had written down and drawn. But I explained to him I was a little bit like a monk. The monks were the people charged with copying all the sacred texts back in the medieval ages, and that's essentially what I had been doing, and it was kind of humorous that I'd held on to it for all these years. But another big day was when we had computers, and instead of writing things down, I began to type them down, and being the pack rat that I am for knowledge, I saved everything I had ever written down and assembled this all into kind of a board review course for internal medicine and then later for cardiology. And I shared this with all of my friends who are also studying for their cardiology boards. Well, writing is one way we share things, but slides are another way we share things. Slides are kind of the currency of education in medicine. And it used to be the definition of an expert was a guy from Boston who had 2 slide carousels. Well, slide carousels went out of style quite a while back, and that was another big day when we began to have PowerPoint presentations. And anyone could modify the slides then. Anyone could change them to make them their own, and we began to share those. In the late 90s, I was living in San Francisco, And I took it on to create a website where we would begin to share all the slides that we have. And while other people were sharing songs, being a doctor, I was sharing slide sets. Turned out to be very popular. The first day I put it up, about 10,000 people downloaded the results of one of the big trials then. So that was a great way to share information freely. However, and that was working well for quite a while. Everything changed when a major publisher called me and said, listen, I'm giving you a courtesy call before I sue you because you have published in our major journal, but you need to understand that you just can't take information from our tables and turn them into bar graphs and then put that on a slide and display it. You have to take the information just as we displayed it in the paper, and we have to give you permission to do that. Well, that seemed kind of overbearing and silly. Then shortly after that, a major cardiovascular society also called me up and said, well, we're going to sue you for copyright violation because, you know, you took that information from your own study and made up the slides and shared them. And that's a violation of copyright. And I figured, boy, this has been a good week. I mean, I have 2 people calling me, threatening to sue me. I must be doing something right. I mean, people are really angry about what I'm doing. And clearly I'm breaking some business model and it's making them upset. I guess the final straw was when a young researcher came to me who'd written a bunch of papers with me and said he didn't have enough money to buy all the articles back that he and I had written together. So, you know, you create the content, you write the article, then someone wants you to pay $30 to get a PDF of that. And that really drove it home to me that, you know, the model isn't working for academia and how we need to be sharing information. So it got me thinking about copyright and got me researching copyright, and it led me back to the monk. The monk really didn't have anyone protecting him. I mean, he was making one copy of the material. Usually that was only going to be read by the one person who paid for it, and they weren't going to really share it with anyone. It was their own personal copy. But everything changed when you had the printing press. And that was the first time you could rapidly copy and distribute a piece of content. And this was very dangerous because suddenly, very quickly, someone could write something bad, say about the king, and mass produce it and mass distribute it. And this really got the people in power very nervous. And so they created, the king in England created copyright. In other words, turn those words around, you had to get the right to copy something. Now, of course, the king didn't have enough time to read all the things that were being published, and he established a company, or let a company take on that task. And they had to give you the right to copy it, and that's what we know as copyright. So really, the original copyright was really a censorship law to preserve the control of information flow on the part of the king. Now, societies matured a while after that, and they then said, well, listen, this is pretty heavy-handed, this copyright law, the censorship. Let's make it a little fair to the individuals. And they said, now, we're going to let you own the content if you write it, and we're not censoring you. I mean, you can write what you want. And then the people who own the printing presses said, well, that's fine. He can write it, but he's never really going to be able to distribute it without my printing press. So if someone wanted to distribute their information, they had to assign ownership to the guy who owned the printing press. And it was very expensive to print and distribute work. And again, to protect the business model, you, as the person who created the content, had to assign that ownership over to the person distributing the content. And we're still there today. I think many textbooks are still paper-based. However, I have to say I think we are winning the struggle in some ways. 85% of medical residents indicate that they don't use paper textbooks, but instead use electronic means to look up information related to medicine. Now, many of you know that textbooks are often outdated before they're printed. Obviously, it represents the views of just a few authors, and there's no broad peer review. There's no video, audio, it's not interactive. And again, this is one-way flow of information from a person at the top of the information food chain down to you. And access is very limited, and it's limited to those people who can afford it. Now, we take for granted in the United States that textbooks are affordable. However, in other countries, the salaries for physicians are much, much lower. On this slide, you can see there's some countries like Kazakhstan where, say, a general practitioner salary is $35 a month. Let me say that again, $35 a month. And they moonlight driving cabs, whatever they have to do to make ends meet. Certainly that person's not going to pay hundreds of dollars for a textbook, and they're certainly not going to pay $500 a year for access to an online encyclopedia, and their hospital's certainly not going to pay $50,000 a year for a license to access medical information online. So there's a tremendous unmet need among our international physicians for free medical content. So whose rights are we really trying to protect? Are we really trying to protect the creator of the content? Are we trying to protect consumers, such as patients? Or the third C, the person who is really distributing the content, the conveyor of the content? I think we really want to protect the rights of our patients and their access to free, life-saving information. Well, I think many of us view competition as individuals competing with each other. But what kind of social Darwinism teaches us is that collaboration is a very, very powerful evolutionary force, and that those groups who are most effective in collaborating are usually most successful. And the old world was a publish or perish world. But what I'm going to tell you is I think the New World Order is collaborate or perish. So in the old world, we had very expensive weapons of mass destruction, but in the New World, we are now fortunate enough to have very inexpensive weapons of mass collaboration. And obviously, with the Arab Spring and other issues, you've seen the impact of large numbers of people being able to rapidly collaborate with other people. The old world was Internet 1.0 world where there was one-way flow of information, but now we live in a Internet 2.0 world where there's participation and bidirectional information flow. Think of things like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Wikipedia. Really has inverted the conversation from a one-way conversation to a two-way conversation. When I was a kid, you'd sit in front of this black and white TV and there would be one show broadcast to millions of people. But now you have millions of songs that can be broadcast to one person. So again, we've inverted the content and the consumer of content and the flow of information. In the old world, we worked in silos, separate from each other, very much a command and control environment, and everyone wanted to be at the top of that pyramid, make their way to the corner office. But in the New World Order, everything is global, or there's globalization. The organizational structure isn't vertical, but it's horizontal. And you see words now like co-creation, collective genius, peering, online collectivism, words that all underscore the importance of collaboration. And rather than a corner office, we now have no offices. We have no walls, and people are even sitting in cubicles. They may just be sitting next to each other. That really is the kind of space that facilitates collaboration. I think how doctors succeed, or the tools that they need to succeed, are changing. In the old world order, it was very individualized. I think in the new world order, there's very much an emphasis on the care by a team. So those people who are the best at being on a team are going to be most successful. So we used to look for the brightest kids, the people who were very successful publishing, and it was a publish or perish model. But again, now we value physicians as team players whose promotion is really predicated on collaboration rather than outshining all their peers. So again, I think we've moved to a collaborate or perish role. With what I do, running clinical trials, we'll run trials at 800 centers around the world. 8,000 people will be involved. If you want to successfully enroll large numbers of people, you have to be a good collaborator. The data is really very large these days and requires multiple centers around the world. And then finally, what is the evidence? In the old days, it was the professor was the evidence. It was an eminence-based medicine. And he would say, in my experience, we should do this. Now we refer to the published literature. And we used evidence-based therapy. A lot of changes in the power gradients with our patients. In the old days, it was a one-way conversation. It was very paternalistic. The doctor was the repository of all the information, and it wasn't really conversation. It was really very much, again, just the doctor saying to the patient, here's what you need to do. But things have changed now, and the patient now comes to you already knowing a lot about their condition. In many cases, they've looked it up, and it really is a partnership, and it really is a two-way conversation between the physician and the patient. With respect to information, the old world was very secretive. You know, you just kept that knowledge within your organization. Companies often didn't look outside themselves to innovate. They innovated from within. And the information flow was such that all the information flowed up to one or two people in the organization. Well, everything again has now been inverted. Now you have open access to much more information, open source software. Companies innovate from outside of themselves rather than from within. And I think there's much more emphasis on information flowing to everyone within the organization rather than just a select few. And rather than a paper world, we're now in an electronic world. And rather than a copyright world, we've moved over to a copyleft world to accommodate this greater desire to collaborate and share. Well, what is copyleft? Well, copyleft isn't just a cute word. It's really a legal doctrine. And what it says is that the information cannot be controlled by any one individual, and that it must remain freely accessible to everyone. You're free to share it, copy it. You just have to give credit to the person who had really created the content in the first place. The software that allows you to do this is called a wiki. It's a free open source software that allows multiple people to co-create and collaborate in creating content. You don't need to be a programmer to do it. It's just like writing in a Word document. Now, what if someone makes a mistake? Well, you can just roll the content back to where it was before. You can discuss the content on a discussion page, and you can be alerted if someone has changed the information. There is a growing realization that the content on a wiki may be less biased because there's no one person in control. It's much more dynamic and really represents more of a consensus view than the view of any one person. On the other hand, I think it's important to remember that we do need experts tending to the content and editing it and overseeing it. Otherwise, we would think the world was flat. I mean, originally, the whole world thought the world was flat. And it wasn't until you had a few experts who showed us that the world was round. So we don't want to get stuck in a mode where we just think the world is flat. Now, the next thing I wanted to say is that the accuracy may be acceptable. The journal Nature compared Encyclopedia Britannica to Wikipedia and found that they had about the same number of errors. And as many of you may know, Encyclopedia Britannica ceased to exist in book form just a few years ago. So what are we looking for in a textbook? We're looking for one that's free, that's continuously updated, that uses the power of social media and is moderated by experts. We want something that's copyleft, that can be freely distributed. We want something that's accessible on mobile devices. We want something that has content at the patient level as well as the doctor level. We have content, 1,200 pages, that are written at the 8th grade level, as well as content written for doctors. We also have 18,000 board review questions, guidelines, multilingual, multimedia. That's where we think things need to be going. We've now had 100 full-time volunteers edit the content 1 million times over 10 years. If you look on this site, we have excellent content in a wide variety of subspecialty areas, but we could also use your help, and we ask that you write to me or call me to get involved. Well, I want to say thank you for joining us here today, and please write to me or contact us through WikiDoc if you would like to help volunteer to free and liberate medical information. Thank you.
Dr. Gibson, this is Dr. Yodo calling from Keystone, Colorado. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
Well, thank you. I'm joined here with Dr. Strickland and Dr. Thompson. And first of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and for that very informative and enlightening presentation. So we appreciate your willingness to participate and being here with us is what I'd like to start with. And then question for you, and I think you answered it in your presentation, but with this Wiki document, how do we prevent misinformation?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me today. And misinformation is an interesting concept. I mean, wikis are created so that no one person can, say, suppress important information. So it is a tool to engage in collaborative authoring, and so that the tribe has a louder voice than any individual. Of course, as I said in my talk, long ago, the tribe had it wrong. They thought the earth was flat, and it took some real, quote, content experts to teach us that the world was actually round. So if everybody's saying that doesn't make it right, we also have to have content experts who moderate these kinds of groups and this kind of content. But again, the idea is that the content is modifiable. It is a consensus-based document, and that if the tribe has it wrong, we can't prevent that, but we hope to prevent it with some oversight by moderated wisdom. But again, the whole purpose is essentially to prevent misinformation and to promote access to correct and timely information.
Mike, this is Mike Strickland. Do you go by Mike? Do I have that right?
Oh, yeah, I go by Mike, sure.
Okay. You and I have discussed a little on the phone or by email. As I understand it, WikiDoc is a free and up-to-date online textbook, essentially. And we talked about how does the individual physician get access to the original data and literature? And would that be different for taxpayer-funded research versus private, say, drug company-funded research?
So, with the references section, if you click on the reference, it usually takes you to the actual PubMed document that research came from. In most of the cardiology areas, infectious disease areas, renal areas, most of that content is very up-to-date and will represent research from primary sources. So you'll go to the article that actually investigated or did a trial on that topic rather than a review article from American Family Practice or something on the topic. So we do try and direct people straight to the primary literature rather than the kind of review article.
And does that link typically take you to the full article, the full document?
Well, I mean, unless, it'll take you at least to the reference in the abstract. Now, if that article is behind a paywall, then obviously you're going to have to pay to get that article. That's one of the things we're trying to combat is paywalls and getting information out from behind the paywalls. But if you want to access the original content, you may, in some circumstances, have to pay for that article.
Are the paywalls similar for taxpayer-funded research, for instance, the NIH or the universities, as opposed to, say, drug company funded?
Well, the NIH and government has now specified that articles published based upon trials or research efforts that are funded by the government cannot be behind paywalls. But there may be some older articles that are.
I had another question then. Thank you for that. Who can contribute and participate in WikiDoc?
Most of the contributions come from people who sit right here in Boston as full-time volunteers. We do have some remote contributors who are physicians, and they make their contributions outside of Boston, sitting at home on their computer. We hook them up with a coach here to make sure they've got the formatting right and the process right, and have someone oversee what they're working on. It does not have to be a physician. We do have students here, pre-medical students, working here in Boston who are closely supervised by physicians in creating content. So the content creation matches the skills of the person. Obviously, a pre-medical student is going to be doing something like uploading copyleft images or correcting grammar, things like that, rather than making original text kind of content. They may also go retrieve some copyleft or copyable content from the U.S. government that may be in certain places on the site. So the content contribution matches the skill level of the contributor.
Okay, great. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but as I understand it, your organization has kind of made an opportunity available for participants in this conference, physician participants, to participate to some degree in WikiDoc, at least during this conference. And we have a category set up under letmydoctorpractice.org/conference, where we have a resolution for EHR and a document entitled HP on American Medicine. And we invite physicians around the country to submit documents, and they could come through us or directly to you if that works, and edit these documents and refine them and improve them, I hope. So correct me if I'm wrong on any of that.
No, that's absolutely right. And a wiki is a tool where everyone can work together to edit a document. That's the whole purpose of it. And you can upload your first version of the document. Then people will sign on to the site. We don't ask for a retinal scan or Visa card or anything. It's just your name and a password and your email address. Then you just hit the button Edit, and just like a word processor, you can start editing the content. Then hit Save at the end, and the content is saved. That way, many people can work together to edit the document.
We greatly appreciate that. And is there a mechanism that shows you the changes that you can follow to see if it's been?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There's a button that says Review History, and you can review the document in every single iteration of you've done. So every single version of the document is permanently stored there. And you can go back, you could say, well, you know, the document was vandalized by someone. We need to restore it to one version back. Well, you can hit the button that restores it back to that version and wipe out the vandalism.
Okay, great. I wondered if you would want to talk a minute about WikiPatient.
Yeah, so WikiPatient is the patient side of things. The doctor content is written for doctors at a level of the general practitioner, in some cases the specialist like cardiology. We have tried to move her and beyond what Wikipedia provides. I mean, Wikipedia is too sophisticated for a patient and maybe not sophisticated enough for a doctor. So we divided into bifurcated. We have the doctor content that is written at a higher level than Wikipedia, and then we have the patient content that is written at a level that's the 5th grade, 8th grade level that anyone hopefully can understand. So we are trying to target the content at 2 different levels, the patient level and the physician level.
Well, thank you. And what I've seen of both websites, they look like tremendous resources. So thank you for what you've done.
Great.
Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a question, Mike, that came from our audience. And here's the question. It's actually 2 parts. I'll read it to you. Can organized collaboration be helpful in a physician movement, number 1? And number 2, how important will it be for physician writers, including bloggers, to be an informational conduit to the public? I think that's the question.
Well, I think the fact that we have not organized is our greatest liability as physicians. We will only succeed get organized. I sadly think that many doctors made their way to where they are today by behaving, by doing what they were told, and the system really rewards compliance. But we're at a point where we really need to speak up, and I think many of those efforts are being led by people in the blogosphere and on Twitter. Those are some of the ways physicians are now finally starting to speak up. And I think we need as many vehicles as possible for physicians to speak up. I think they're very scared about speaking up because many of them are now employed. And they're afraid of offending their employer. And certainly, it was much easier government to exercise some dominion and control over physicians when they're all employed, rather than if they're 1 million different individual contractors. So we've lost our voice as physicians, and we must regain that voice if we are to regain control of medicine and do what's right for our patients.
I totally agree with you. I think for the benefit of patients, for the benefit of healthcare in this country, we actually need a very vibrant, independent physician base that does not feel intimidated in any way, that has the freedom to speak up, because, as I mentioned to one of our other speakers, we are really the only ones in all of society that can speak from a physician's perspective to what we do and why we do it. And so I think just to speak from that standpoint in a very open, honest, non-inflammatory way is huge.
Absolutely, and we need the communication tools, the communication venues to do that. And right now, the blogosphere and Twitter and perhaps YouTube, some of those are the tools or venues that physicians are using to start to get the word out.
Another question for you. As you know, there's been this explosion of information, and especially information accessible on the internet. And we are dealing with our previous talks today. We're on electronic health records and IT, and we're going through a transition process. There's no doubt in my mind when we look back at this point in time, those systems will be perfected. But as we go through that, if you were to look out 10 years from now, 15 years from now, looking at all this and how physicians take care of patients, what do you think the interface would be between something like electronic health records, the internet, and WikiDocs? What would that look like?
Well, I think there is a lot of information, and that sounds good, but what people are really, really looking for is for someone to help them digest that information. People are looking more for a quarterback to help lead them rather than a team of 10,000 people. They want someone to help hold their hand and do all this and figure out what makes sense. So I do think we will see some global trends. We will see patients being more empowered with more data, more information. I think that's good. We will be having conversations with patients that are bidirectional, and that's positive. On the other hand, they need a lot of help understanding what's relevant and not relevant. They're getting overwhelmed with a barrage of information from wearables and devices like that. How do they make sense of all that information? How do they make sense of on the internet? Who is reliable on the internet? What content is reliable on the internet? So I do see the physician being more and more as a teammate, helping them sift through all this. But I hope it won't distract from the very credible information that their doctor, who's gone to medical school for many years and has practiced for many years, is providing them. I think we have to be very careful distinguishing data and information from wisdom. When you practice for many years, when you've seen, thousands of cases just like this, it's very important to take the art of medicine and the wisdom of medicine into account. I think we also have to teach both doctors and patients how to be better consumers of information. They need to do a better job of understanding statistics. If someone does 30 cases a year and the confidence intervals surrounding their performance on a report card are vast, then it's impossible to compare physicians to each other when you have that wide of a confidence interval. None of the limitations of physician scorecards were recently published by the journalist, only the complication. None of the limitations, the fact that, many of the confounders may not have been identified in adjusting for outcomes, that if someone didn't enter the ICD-9 code for that patient's diabetes, well, that didn't count as a comorbidity. The fact that when you have that small of numbers of patients, you can't really make these formal assessments and compare people. That wasn't really talked about in the release of the scorecard. So we need to educate consumers, and we need to educate administrators about the limitations of these big data approaches that are now being thrown into the medical practice arena.
We only have about a minute left. Any other questions?
I do have a question. I'll make it quick because I'd rather hear what you have to say than I. Do you have a vision for how physicians can begin to restore a voice of authority in our profession?
I think courage. I think the courage to speak up, whether it's in your hospital, to your patients, on social media, get involved politically. This isn't a scientific issue. It isn't an intellectual issue. This is a political issue. And we must restore our credibility first, and we must also restore our kind of rightful, claim on being the patient's advocate and having their trust, and really think people follow our guidance when what comes best for a patient. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think it's going to take the courage to speak up and also the courage to restore all of our credibility.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Gibson, thank you so much for taking time to be with us at our conference here, and for your wonderful comments and for everything you've done for medicine as a cardiologist and as this person who's come up with WikiDoc. So we thank you again.